So this is not personal to anyone else. This is personal to me. But I did overhear somebody say something, maybe at the beginning of retreat, that made me think about something a lot. And so this isn't a reflection on them at all. But they said something about, oh, I might have to work through this retreat, and then next year I'll like have a full retreat. And I remember I didn't say anything, but this caution light went off in my head, and I'm like, wonder how that will work. I don't think I'd planned that far ahead. That's what I was thinking. But really what it made me think about is something you might not know this, but I actually think about generosity a lot when in relationship to offering service. It's very good for my mind, and I've done this for years, although I'm not sure how much I have to say about it yet. But when I was in Seattle, one thing that Darshan Rinpoche made me aware of in his very unique way was what was the difference between being generous and giving, and what was a transaction. He'd always say, this is business. And he'd make it, there were instances where you might think something was not that, but it was a transaction happening, not really what generosity is about. So that's always stayed with me, and also that I don't think I could ever remember him speaking when he didn't talk about it all depends on your motivation. I just can't remember any time that he hasn't said that. So that kind of comes into this. So regarding offering service, we are offering, so it's a practice of generosity. And then I find that sometimes my mind is not so in that mode. And so this is why I work on generosity, because who wants to live with a dissatisfied mind or whatever's going on? And I didn't really take it very deep. I would just tell myself to, take delight in giving and get over it, and just, but I realized that, I did learn some things, but I had kind of struggled with this line, I think it's in Shantideva and maybe some other prayers where I'm a little bit challenged to give without a sense of loss. So this retreat, I thought about that a little bit more, and I realized that what's happening for me then, because that kind of makes me feel sad, and I'm not always sad, but I realized that what I'm doing is I have strings attached. So then what came up for me in this retreat was Edward Scissorhands. Edward Scissorhands. It was the name of a movie that came out in 1990, and I actually don't remember much of the movie, but I do remember this character who seemed to have a lot of blue. I think maybe he only wore blue, I'm not sure. But he didn't have hands, he had scissors. And so he'd made ice sculptures, and I don't know, I don't actually remember much about the movie, but I did use this retreat. And when things came up, I would get out my scissor hands and I would go like this all around me and cut these strings of attachment. And when I was in here and it was coming up in my mind, I'd put my hands between my legs and go clip, 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 clip. And it was like this recognition in my mind that I've got strings attached here and I need to clip those. And then I thought, maybe I should read about this a little bit and learn something from somebody, the masters who know something. And the word tight-fistedness came up. And I was like, I don't really feel tight-fisted. But then I realized, it really is what that is. It is like you're holding on to something. Like, why is there a sense of loss? Because you're holding on to something. Why are you giving with strings attached? Because you're holding on to these strings. So the word tight-fistedness did end up kind of working for me in terms of helping me understand that one way, shape, or form, attachment is usually arising. I'm holding on to something. And so when I think about offering service, sometimes I can remember I remember when we were doing Gautami. I think or maybe it was this building. I think I was working on the kitchen design. And we were having EML outside, but I was in my office listening to everybody laugh. Then the joy of giving was a little bit diminished and jealousy came up, And then there's times where I recognize in myself that I'm wanting appreciation for something. So you're giving with a sense of, or status or whatever it is. There's always something there. And because I didn't analyze this much, when I was reading, I was kind of surprised at some of the things I read. One thing that didn't surprise me was Nagarjuna's way he talked about this. He has a commentary on the perfection of wisdom in 25,000 lines. And in one short thing, he says, what is meant by giving? Giving refers to an instance of giving wherein there's a corresponding instance of wholesome intentionality. So you can give in what he calls an impure way, or you can give in a pure way. And they have a long list of impure ways, which was kind of interesting to look at and recognize some things in myself, but what I really recognize is the times where it feels good, why it works for me is when I clean up my motivation, and then the intentionality is in the proper manner. But for instance, looking at these impure giving, one, he says it may involve superficial giving in which you're really not taking any interest. And we all know that, we're just kind of going through the motions, and there's not a lot of joy in that. But he has other ones where you're actually kind of wanting something in return, like wealth or attention, or maybe you're trying to have the intention of manipulating somebody into feeling pleased, or you're giving out of a sense of obligation. One that I hadn't ever thought of, the jealousy one I can see, but perhaps giving as a means of struggling for dominance. That's I guess that's possible. I don't know. So it's good for us to look at what our motivations are, and going through these lists, I think, is helpful because it makes you just kind of look and find these things in your mind. And then the other thing that was surprising to me when I read about this was I remembered that you had taught about these verses from Nagarjuna where he talks about giving as a way to get rid of afflictions. And I had focused on that teaching of these 20-some antidotes to certain afflictions, but I'd always focused on the side of the afflictions. I'd never really thought about why giving helps. I would try to do that in my mind. I was struggling with jealousy at that time. And the antidote that we were taught really didn't work very well for me, be joyful. And I'm I'm not joyful about this. But then he would say kind of something to the effect of, with a mind that wants to give, you're mindfully respectful of the recipient. And for me, being mindfully respectful actually helped me cut the jealousy, because I would then look at the person that was getting something that I wanted, that I was jealous of, and I would look at them and realize, wow, this is good for them. This is, it would help me to kind of get outside of myself and look at the other person. That was helpful. So I used his antidotes a lot, but I hadn't really thought about what the relationship of generosity was to the afflictions. And then in the Lam Rim, this also surprised me, but it's kind of a no-brainer. It just never entered my mind before. Because I always thought about ethics first, but in the Six Perfections, they talk about generosity helping you with your ethics. And I always kind of thought it would be the other way around. Your ethics would help you with your generosity. But when you think about it, it does make a lot of sense because, for instance, when you want to develop compassion or loving kindness for someone, it helps to respect them. It's hard to develop loving kindness for somebody that you don't like or respect. And in this one, I think it's a little similar where, you can start with ethics, but actually, if you weren't so tight-fisted, if you didn't have so much attachment to something, you wouldn't be trying to protect anything. You wouldn't get yourself into trouble. Attachment is what leads us to a lot of negative behaviors. And so it's kind of like going more directly to the source to combat the miserliness or the tight-fistedness or whatever the attachment that's holding on to something, then it's just plain easier. If you have less attachment, you'll be less likely to do harm. And that's why in the Lam Rim, how they explain one of the perfections helping the next one, that's kind of how that works. And it seems really sensible to me, but even when I read it in Nagarjuna and then read it in Tsongkhapa, I was I don't get that. And I had to kind of think that one through. And I think basically the bottom line is this is one retreat where I've been learning more about attachment. So I'm kind of maybe going more directly to the issue on some things, whereas before I think I really was, I don't know, I was more focused on other afflictions, I would say, and not always, if I'm working more with anger and having to get that settled down first, then I'm not going to really work with the attachment so directly. But once your anger is more settled down, you can see what's leading me to that anger, things like that. So I would invite other people to look at how you can take delight in giving and recognize that some of the benefits are amazing. And I'll just read a few, because Nagarjuna, I just love the way he writes this. Like, it is the condition for nirvana. And that's like, really? Well, it's because you're going to minimize all these afflictions, and that's kind of what you need to do. But he also says it's a treasure trove which constantly follows along with a person. So it's like you're packing yourself something that you can carry with you. It's like a mental attitude that you can take with you. It destroys suffering and bestows bliss on people. I'm only going to read a few, but I liked some of these in particular. It's a house of goodness, for it draws in good people. It's a source of peace and security, for one reaches the end of one's life, one's mind remains free of fear. That would be amazing. Defeats the enemy miserliness. It's a path of purity traveled by Aryas, and it's the accumulation of goodness and meritorious qualities. So it is listed as the primary condition for the realization of nirvana. That's what Nagarjuna says. So when you think of it in terms of, combating attachment, and this craving that gets us into so much trouble, then that kind of falls into place. So as we think about our offering service, maybe think about one other thing that has helped me is to recognize that I don't own any of the roles that I have played or ever have done here. Those aren't things I own. They change, and other people come in, and like what I've noticed personally, and this week is an excellent example of that, is like the retreat from afar. Wow, that was really something this year. Somebody stepped in there and really took it to another level. And this is, why don't we want to rejoice at this when a role that you had once goes to somebody else, and then they just make it so beneficial for people. So, let's think about these roles we have. They do change. You're not always going to do the same thing when you're here. So as we get ready for our next various meetings that we're going to have, we might want to think about how we can cultivate our generosity around offering service and really make it an offering and come back to our motivation and expand our mind from where it might fall sometimes, and then just change that.